Welcome to The Shift, Mondoweiss's regular discussion of Palestine and U.S. politics. I am Adam Horowitz, Mondoweiss's managing editor. And on today's discussion, we will be talking about a big night at the polls where AIPAC was on the ballot in Philadelphia and in Kentucky. It did not go well for them. Spoiler alert. But joining me on today's conversation is Michael Aria, our U.S. correspondent and author of our weekly politics newsletter, The Shift. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Adam.
Yes. Sign up for Michael's newsletter in the notes that go along with the show, and be sure to subscribe to the Mondoweiss YouTube channel to never miss an episode. Michael, we have a big night of elections to talk about. Like I said, in both Philadelphia and Kentucky, there were sort of momentous primary elections as far as AIPAC and the Israel lobby is concerned, momentous in different ways. We're going to dig into it. But I will say that AIPAC has something to worry about in both cases. Let's start in Philadelphia. This is with a race that we have discussed before here, that you've written about at the site. This is Pennsylvania's 3rd district, which is right in the middle of Philadelphia. It's regarded as the bluest district in the country. And in this race, we had sort of a three-headed race, which I kind of feel like in some ways is sort of the 3 different flavors that we're kind of seeing in Democratic Party elections now. We had Ellis Stanford, who was this sort of AstroTurf AIPAC candidate, which you could get into what her connection to AIPAC was. We had Sharif Street, who was the Democratic Party machine candidate. His father had been mayor of Philadelphia. He himself was endorsed by J Street, which is sort of the representing this kind of mainstream Democratic Party position when it comes to Israel. And then on the left, we had Chris Rabb, who was sort of a candidate who comes out of the Democratic Socialists of America and took a much more radical position on Palestine. And he also ran away with this election. So tell us, how did this happen, and what we're going to dig into what some of the takeaways are here.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just set it up very well. I mean, you had Chris Rabb, who is not just a advocate for Palestinian human rights, but also a vocal critic of Israel. And I think most would say goes a lot further than most people currently in Congress, save like Rashida Tlaib and a couple others. But you're talking about a person here, a 5-time state senator, who not only calls for a ceasefire in the region, but is also calling for a full-on arms embargo against Israel. It's calling for all Palestinian prisoners being held without due process to be released. And I think kind of most notably is called for recognizing the Palestinian right of return for refugees. So as you say, his 2 main opponents here, Dr. Ellis Stanford, who I think it's worth pointing out, all 3 of these people that we mentioned have criticized Israel, which also speaks to kind of the shift that we're seeing. There was a prominent candidate here who was saying, yeah, like Netanyahu's great, let's keep going with the genocide. We had, as you say, Sharif Street, who was backed by the liberal Zionist group J Street and their political action committee. This is somebody who called Netanyahu a war criminal, and on the other hand, refused to back anything in terms of conditioning U.S. military aid to Israel. Then you have Ellis Stanford, who has also criticized Netanyahu, but drew a lot of criticism for a couple of reasons. The first reason being that at one point during a debate, she compared use of the word genocide in the context of Gaza to someone using the N-word, basically making the argument that using the word genocide within the context of Gaza is offensive to Jewish people, presumably because the Holocaust is the only genocide in her view. She compared it to using the N-word. That obviously caught a lot of mainstream attention, a lot of backlash from local activists. As you said already, I think this is the arguably the bluest, or I think in terms of numbers, the bluest district in the entire country. So, it skews obviously liberal and progressive. That was a big focus and a big criticism from a lot of people. The other major thing here is AIPAC's role or alleged role. I mean, it depends who you talk to. There was reporting by Drop Site News about a month ago that AIPAC, and Stanford has denied ever taking any money from AIPAC, but there was a report that AIPAC was kind of funneling money into this race through something called 314 Action Fund Super PAC, which they've actually used before if people remember 2024, the Oregon Democratic primary, the same group, it was revealed AIPAC, I think, had funneled something like $1 million into that group to be used. And that's something about that we talk about a lot on this podcast too, which is AIPAC has become, I think, so toxic that it has to use these outside groups or these third-party PACs shell PACs to kind of get the money through, because we know that now being backed by AIPAC, or even the rumor or insinuation that you might be taking money from AIPAC or an AIPAC connected group, potentially it has a negative impact when people go to the polls. Democratic voters, the last NBC poll, over 60% of Democratic voters now have a negative view of Israel. I don't know what the numbers are in this specific, the third district. That's obviously never been polled, but I have to imagine they're much higher based on the fact this is the bluest district. So I think that is one of the major takeaways here. I thought that was maybe the most interesting part of the race in terms of our beat, in terms of the things that we're going to discuss today. Big article today that I would encourage everybody to check out at the Washington Post. So this has hit kind of the mainstream media. And we know that, once mainstream publications start covering the stuff that we've been covering for many years, it is evidence that it is not, it has kind of come out of the bottle, that it's become a much bigger issue and something that insiders and political insiders and people in Washington are talking about. But this headline in the Washington Post: AIPAC can tank a candidate even when it spends nothing. And throughout this piece, it just kind of talks about how the issue of AIPAC and AIPAC funding and this 314 action fund really hovered over the entire race, and really not only damaged Stanford, but I think kind of propelled Rabb to his victory. In the case of Street, who a lot of people thought 6 months ago was going to kind of cruise to victory here, and as you said, comes out of the political machine. His dad was a politician. He tried to take that middle ground and was backed by Jay Street. And I think that's also an interesting thing when we talk about our beat and the stuff we talk about every week, because we have talked about quite a bit about how these liberal Zionist groups like J Street are kind of losing their ground, so to speak, where it's like the people who usually back them, or the voters usually back them, have moved further and further to the left. And there isn't really that middle position. AIPAC's obviously skeptical of J Street because they think they're insufficiently pro-Israel, whereas most Democratic voters, I think, are becoming increasingly skeptical of a liberal Zionist group because they think they're too pro-Israel. So there's not a lot of ground left for a group like that. So I thought Street kind of falling out of this race, where he seemed like the obvious winner not that long ago, was also extremely notable.
Yeah, no, 100%. And when we talked about this race previously, one of the things that was interesting, and I haven't seen the final numbers, I don't know if you've seen in terms of just like money on hand, but it did seem clear that Stanford was clearly the money leader in this race. And when we first covered this race, she was, I think the only poll that had become public at that point was an internal poll that her campaign had put on. But at that point, she was leading this race. And Rabb was kind of the surprise second place candidate, which even that kind of gave him some momentum at that point. But at one point, it looked like this was a race that she was going to run away with. And then AIPAC became an issue. And as of the vote totals last night, she came in a distant third. I mean, this also was not a case where, say, Street and Stanford sort of split some mainstream Democratic vote and Rabb benefited.
Right.
This race was not close. I mean, Rabb ended up with 30,000 more votes than Stanford, about 20,000 more votes than Street. He ran away with this race in ways that are shocking. And one of the things, so there's the AIPAC part of it, which is notable and was definitely a topic in this race. And so AIPAC was clearly among the losers here. AIPAC was one of the big losers, but one of the other big losers here was just the mainstream Democratic Party. Not only did Street come out of this sort of Democratic Party machine in Philadelphia, including the current mayor of Philadelphia, Sherelle Parker, who is kind of, she's a Democrat, but she's kind of made a big part of her reputation has been punching left and going after further more liberal members of the city council. And so she was completely behind Street, but also some national figures like, Cory Booker was traveling to Philadelphia to campaign for Street. And this whole Democratic Party firmament sort of fell on their face here. So the voters were not just rejecting AIPAC, which they clearly were, but they were kind of rejecting the current state of the Democratic Party, which we're now seeing. Like, these two issues are going hand in hand in all of these primaries, both support for Palestine and rejection of the Democratic Party establishment. I think that this race was just a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and just to put a point on that, I'm glad you brought up Cory Booker, because he was a rally. He had a rally go viral, which it looked like there were 6 people at this thing for street, and he was trying to get them to participate in some chant where he put Street's name in it. And just the entire thing was a little silly, and just it became kind of clear just by watching that campaign kind of had no juice, so to speak. But the other interesting thing that I thought that happened within the last week, and we covered this in the last episode, or the last installment, the newsletter version of The Shift, as Adam mentioned, you can sign up if you don't already on our website, is Josh Shapiro, who kind of back-channeled or secretly kind of became involved in this race, according to people. I think at least a few sources, in Axios reported that he was kind of working behind the scenes to get organizations in Philadelphia to back off backing Rabb, right? To stop Rabb. And there's a wider context there, which is that we haven't mentioned this yet, but Rabb was backed, as you mentioned, DSA, Sunrise Movement, a lot of left-wing groups that people know. He was also backed by some prominent politicians on the left side of the aisle, people like Summer Lee, but also, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and AOC. It's been reported for a while that AOC has presidential aspirations. There's been, criticisms of her in terms of what she said at the DNC regarding, Harris and Biden working towards a ceasefire. This kind of ongoing debate about her position on that issue. She's, I think within the last couple months kind of shifted her position on what's referred to as defensive weapons. What's interesting is Shapiro is also expected to run. So when you look at this kind of stuff, there's all these little kind of like proxy wars, and that was reported in the Axios piece, that the kind of wider context, we're not just talking about local races. As I mentioned, I think in my piece today, this is not an isolated incident. We know that the polling that I just mentioned in terms of Democratic voters show that virtually every primary is being transformed along these lines. And there's all the reason in the world to believe, especially after what happened in 2024, that it's going to help define the lines of who ends up becoming the Democratic nominee in 2028.
Yeah. I mean, it very much seems that this victory, Rabb's victory in Philadelphia, is sort of a proof of concept for any person who wants to run in the Democratic Party in this farther left lane, whether it be on Palestine, which, I mean, Rabb was outspoken on, and it certainly didn't hurt, and it probably only helped his candidacy. But then any number of other issues, whether it be, war in Iran, anti-ICE, any other, position that the Democrats are being pushed on. Rabb was that was his platform, and he won overwhelmingly, which I just think this is something that we're going to start seeing in more and more races.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. And so in as much as this election in Philadelphia was this sort of litmus test look at the Democratic Party, we kind of had another race last night in Kentucky, which gave us a flip side look in the Republican Party, in which AIPAC also played, and in this time, a much more public role with Tom Massie. Can you tell us what happened in this race?
Thomas Massie is, or was, I guess, or still in office, but soon to not be, incumbent in Kentucky's 4th congressional district. And as people probably know, he has kind of run afoul of President Trump in recent months, actually over the past year. I think at the outset, I should say that those issues with the president and the reason why Trump targeted him in recent weeks really transcend Israel. This is a guy who is kind of more in the mold, very firm on the Constitution, kind of more in a Rand Paul type of mold, in terms of opposing, foreign aid to other countries. And that includes, aid to Israel. He's consistent about that. He also was one of only, I believe, 2 Republicans to vote against Trump's, big budget bill. And he also has pushed consistently in Congress for the DOJ to release the entirety of the Epstein files, which many people, have talked about Trump's connection to those files and whether the extent to which he is in them. So he angered the president for a whole bunch of reasons. I think there's two ways to look at this race. The first way is that, Randy Fine, noted pro-Israel Congress member, Islamophobic, infamous. We cover him on the site a lot. He had a tweet last night, something to the effect of, "It's Donald Trump's party. We're all just living in it." Basically saying that Trump still calls the shots and it still is the kingmaker when it comes to the Republican Party. And we see these articles all the time about kind of like, this wing, these people like Massie, Tucker Carlson, maybe MAGA, so to speak, is like breaking away from the president or they're becoming a little more critical on Israel. But last night, I think we saw, and a lot of people expected this. A lot of people expected Massie to be ousted, and he was. And there's one way to look at it, which is that Trump was able to oust him. We haven't even mentioned the person that won, which is this guy, Ed Galrain, who's a former Navy SEAL, backed by Trump, obviously very conservative. The other way to look at this is the fact that the Israel lobby, this is the most expensive race in the history of the House by many metrics. And what's interesting, or every metric, and what's interesting is that it is the top three in that regard are all races where the Israel lobby intervened heavily. So the other two most expensive races are the race to oust Jamal Bowman, which happened in 2024, and the race to oust Cori Bush, which also happened in 2024. So all of the most expensive races in House history since the United States has existed have involved the Israel lobby. They spent almost 16 million, I think 15.8 on this race, and just AIPAC spent 9 million, I believe, on this race to oust Massie. And obviously AIPAC is taking a victory lap when it comes to this. They're tweeting their usual stuff about how, being pro-Israel is good policy and good politics. They love to tweet stuff like that. But as everybody knows, and, multiple people have pointed out online, if that were true, if being pro-Israel was good politics, then you wouldn't have to spend $16 million to oust a candidate that, he would have lost with, or he would have won or lost without that money. So I think there's two ways to kind of look at that. I don't know if AIPAC would have prevailed if you didn't have the kind of prevailing winds of that Trump targeting of Massie. So even though they're taking a victory lap on this, I find it kind of hard to believe that, they could have landed a blow against this guy who, it's worth pointing out, was popular. He was an incumbent before Trump came along, and he's not the first person who's run afoul of Trump, who we know demands, total 100% loyalty. Or there was just last week, I think, he had kind of turned on Representative Boebert, who, after she had come to Kentucky to back to endorse Massie or to campaign for him. So even just other Republicans coming to support of somebody that Trump has targeted for criticism and attacks, generates criticism of that person from the president. So I think that of course, AIPAC and the Israel lobby is going to want to take a victory lap. I saw there's a Jewish Insider newsletter out today, the title of which is something like "Pro-Israel Groups Celebrate Massie's Loss." But 16 million for a GOP, a party that there was no threat of anybody even being anti-Israel not that long ago. 16 million, and needing the backing of the most powerful person in the world, literally, in order to take it out. I don't. To me, that's not really much of a victory to write home about. I don't know how you feel, but that was kind of my big takeaway.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I totally agree. And it's one of the reasons why, when I kick this off, I regard this in many ways as so like AIPAC clearly was a loser in Philadelphia. But the fact that one of the things that we saw in Kentucky last night was like, this is what it's going to take for AIPAC to be public and have a victory in a race, which is to in again one of the sort of safest sort of political environments you could imagine, this kind of like far right wing kind of pro-Trump area, that they had to spend the most money of any race in history just to hang on to to defeat this one person. It's sort of an example of this kind of Pyrrhic victory where yes, they won, but it kind of actually shows you what they're up against, and it does not look good for them. I mean, that they are really following. They've become this sort of punching bag in both parties, and are they going to be able to spend $15 million in every congressional race around the country? I don't think so. Like, it's what does the future for AIPAC in elections look like if this is what it takes in Kentucky's 4th district?
Yeah, I think they have major problems in that regard. I do think Randy Fine has a point. I have to admit, like, I do think that, Trump remains very influential among the Republican Party. It is his Republican Party in many ways. I think that AIPAC's grip on, I think I put this in the piece, their grip on GOP politics is obviously fairly firm compared to what's going on in the Democratic Party. And for that reason, I'd say that the Rabb loss to me is such a bigger loss than the Massie win, because I think in Massie, we're talking about a guy who kind of on principle is opposing foreign aid of any kind. But this is not a guy who, has like deep connections to the Palestine activism movement. It's not somebody who's talking about the right of return or is talking much at all about what goes on in foreign countries beyond the U.S.'s interest. And that's his politics. I mean, he obviously represents something that, Trump has talked about before, this idea of like, America first, or kind of like a more nativist view of the world in terms of foreign policy. In the case of Rabb, they're sending, he's going to immediately be one of the most left members of the House. As soon as he gets it, he's expected to easily cruise to victory, obviously, because it's such a blue district in the general election. And they'll have, yet another person in Congress who is kind of highlighting these issues that we're talking about. So to me, AIPAC doesn't want that type of person, especially a kind of person who's going to be maybe popular in his district and is going to continue winning. That to me is a much bigger deal than just picking off the one Republican, especially now that Marjorie Taylor Greene is no longer in Congress. Really, the only Republican, occasionally Rand Paul, but more or less the only Republican who kind of has centered some of these issues. I saw no momentum, obviously, for Massie. It wasn't like his message seemingly is spreading among other Republican lawmakers, unlike when we talk about these kind of like Democratic debates. I feel like there's obviously more of that.
Yes, but one thing that was interesting that I saw about this Massie race, and one of the things I'm always interested in is, and we kind of did this with Rabb, like, what does this tell us about the Democratic Party moving forward? There was a very interesting I guess it was exit poll coming out of yesterday that showed the age breakdown in terms of the Massie voter versus the Galrain voter. And it was, because we see very similar polling in some ways amongst Republicans, that there's this generational split, like in the same way we see a generational split amongst Democrats, where younger voters, by younger, I mean voters like under 50, are much more pro-Palestinian than older voters. The same generational split exists amongst Republicans, and that was true with this Massie vote, where it was really the sort of the older voters, the boomer voters that kind of got him out of office. And so I guess one of my questions is, it does seem like there's this contingent within the Democratic Party that is starting to win elections and starting to build sort of this cohort of power that's taking advantage of this, sympathy with Palestinians. It doesn't quite seem like that's happening yet with Republicans. And if anything, these few outliers like Massie or Marjorie Taylor Greene, as you point out, have sort of been forced out of the party. I mean, Massie was sort of party leadership led by Trump, and with the help of AIPAC, got him to lose this election. Marjorie Taylor Greene stepped down from, her position. I'm wondering how you see these politics playing out in the GOP. Is there going to be a politician or a group of people amongst the Republicans that start to exploit the sympathy for Palestinians in the way that there have been with Democrats?
That's an interesting question. I mean, my cynical take, and I don't usually like to do political projections because who's to say? I mean, Donald Trump is president, so it's anything can happen, anything goes. Having said that, it would not really surprise me if the last couple months that what we've seen from Marjorie Taylor Greene, or even what we've seen from Tucker Carlson, is all just kind of a lead up to them and people kind of who associate with them backing a presidency of J.D. Vance. Because I do think, like, in recent weeks, and as the war was unpopular as soon as it started, but as it's clear that now you have Robert Kagan, like long-term neoconservatives in places like the Atlantic, coming out and saying this war is done, it's lost, it's Trump can't win it, and everybody who pumps gas into this car in this country, I think, is aware of the impact that it's having. So I think that as the president becomes more and more unpopular among the American people, and as the war goes, further and further south from the perspective of the United States, I do think that what's been interesting is that I think we've seen a lot of leaks from the Vance camp already kind of poising him to run, where you see these kind of suggestions like, oh, he was the one in the room who kind of was skeptical of it, or he's the one in the room who was the most kind of critical of Iran or had a different stance. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being a situation where you get a Vance who it's gonna be a lot. If that happens, it's gonna be a lot. Ironically, it's gonna be a lot like 2024, where you had Harris, who the question was whether she would distance herself adequately from Biden, I think, to get any votes when it came to this issue. And she obviously didn't. She did quite the opposite. She said she wouldn't change a thing. And she paid the price in many ways, especially in places like Michigan. Does Vance look at that and think he's going to go the opposite way? Hey, I admire Donald Trump. He was a great president. However, I do disagree with him about some fundamental things. I think we need to take the party in a different direction. It wouldn't surprise me if he was able, you say the same kind of thing on the left, where, somebody like Obama was able to, channel or, corral the anti-war sentiment of the Bush years into support for him. Can Vance do the same thing among that crowd? I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Certainly, there was some chance last night for Thomas Massie at his concession speech for him to run for president. I personally don't really see that getting off the ground. And if it did, I wouldn't imagine that he would get much of the vote. Although he did have a good joke, I thought, during that concession speech, where he said he had to call his opponent to concede, but didn't know where to find him in Tel Aviv. And that was my final point here, which is that Massie leaned very heavily into this and explicitly said in the days before, this is a referendum on whether Israel can buy a seat. So even that, I think, is a shift of a kind. This stuff used to be kind of in the shadows, and maybe, a site like Mondowise, which is viewed as kind of like, from the subterranean world by the mainstream media, would cover stuff like this, but you wouldn't see it so explicitly. You wouldn't see it from politicians. You wouldn't see it in the Washington Post. And here in Massie's case, you see him leaning into it, making jokes about his opponent being in Tel Aviv, saying straight up, Israel's trying to buy the seat. So even the fact that you could say this out loud, a mainstream politician, I think is kind of notable and does speak to the shift that we talk about.
Yeah, there was a great interview that was done, I guess, this past weekend with him on CBS News, where they were having a very explicit conversation around AIPAC, pro-Israel lobby's role, pro-Israel donors' role in this election. And then at one point, the interviewer, I forget who it was at CBS, just like asked Massie straight on, "Are you anti-Semitic?" To which, like, Massie was like, "I'm sorry, what?" And he asked him again, and his answer, I believe, was just "hell no." Like, it just like ridiculing this type of very traditional response to this, but it just feels like that entire game is up. Like, nobody is really buying that anymore, and that these sort of pro-Israel, whether it's pro-Israel lobby or pro-Israel sort of commentators, are trying to make someone out like Massie as this sort of like huge like anti-Semite. It's just very clear that and I think he didn't win this race, but I do think that message had traction that that this money is playing a dangerous role in U.S. politics.
Yeah, and we haven't even mentioned it because it was such a non-story, but they obviously, these pro-Israel groups obviously attempted to smear Rabb as anti-Semitic, and, a lot of these pro-Israel websites like Jewish Insider and other places, they continue to, and it just had, barely talked about, no effect, obviously, on the electorate, or it wasn't that long ago, a couple months ago when Jesse Jackson passed away, and we were, running stuff on the site about his runs for president and his political legacy, and just writing about that and reflecting on that. And we talked to James Zogby for a piece, who had worked with him obviously very closely, and just what the mainstream media did and what pro-Israel groups did in terms of someone like that, and how those smears were just so effective, because that's true not even that as long ago as the 80s, but even 5-10 years ago, you could potentially end somebody's career by just accusing them of anti-Semitism. I think it's clear that the U.S. electorate, I think they've developed, on this issue, and kind of see through that stuff, that, the Rabb attacks just had absolutely no effect. They just went nowhere. And it's just another just sign of how the
the discourse has shifted on this issue completely. All right. I just want to end, and this is going to put you on the spot slightly, so I'm sorry to do that. But yesterday was a big day of primaries. There are going to be, we're in this sort of primary season right now. 2 weeks from now, probably next time we talk, we will just have had the primary race in New Jersey, which has, just to put on people's radar, another one of the races that we've been following in New Jersey's 12th district, where there's a candidate named Adam Hamawi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who you interviewed, who is a surgeon who went to Gaza, served. I volunteered in Gaza during the genocide, and based on what he saw there, came back and decided he needed to run to Congress because of what the U.S. was supporting in that genocide. And I'm wondering if you could say something just briefly, because you had a chance to talk to him. By the next time we talk, this primary will just have happened. We could include the link to your interview with him in the show notes here. But this race will happen again probably before we talk again. So, what can you tell us about this race in New Jersey's 12th district?
Yeah, this is an interesting race. This is one of these big, open, crowded races where kind of anything can happen, because this is one of these races where you have a retiring incumbent. So in this case, you have Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, who's been there for a while. She's retiring. As you mentioned, I spoke to him about what compelled him to run. He talked about his time in Gaza. He's running on a number of domestic issues. He's centering, the idea of abolishing ICE and criticizing Democrats for supporting it. He also spoke about this wider battle over Palestine and Israel that's raging within the Democratic Party, which we talk about here every week. And I think, one of the other interesting components to him, and we haven't mentioned this about Rabb actually, but I'm glad you brought this up, is that he's also being backed by this pro-Palestine super PAC called American Priorities. Mm-hmm. Rabb was backed by a PAC called PAL-PAC, which we've covered. But even the fact that these groups are kind of players on the scene is pretty notable. I remember not even that long ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago at the site, we were covering the fact that, these groups like USCPR or JVP were actually creating political action committees or groups where they could actually endorse candidates and raise money for them. And that struck us people at the time as pretty notable, because prior to that, the only groups that had the resources, or the only side that had the resources to do that, was the pro-Israel side. But that has naturally changed based on what we've been talking about for the last half hour. Now it's a situation where you can raise money for a group for a candidate based on the fact that they're pro-Palestine. You can raise money based on that. And he is, I believe, at the moment, last time I checked, or I reported that piece a couple weeks ago, it has the most money out of anybody in that race. There's a lot of people. I think there's 14 candidates running. And in the first quarter alone, he raised over $500,000. So it just goes back to what we've been talking about the whole time. This message resonates with the American U.S. voters. It resonates with Democratic voters in particular. And I think we saw the proof last night in Pennsylvania that it can be a key to victory for Democratic candidates.
Would you go as far as saying that it's both good policy and good politics?
I'd say that definitively. It's good policy and good politics to be pro-Palestine.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Michael. Last night was a big night. This story will continues in 2 weeks in New Jersey, but I think we're going to be seeing something similar where, Palestine is, it's on the ballot in all these elections, and at least Democratic voters are coming out in support. So thank you for that. We will follow that, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thanks, Adam. Take care.
All right. Bye.